Hello there, my name's Card. I'm a long-time progressive organiser and community activist. Here on my YouTube page, I've recently taken to making these short, instructive and practical videos about what I know and what I've learned. In this video, I'll be talking about our modern progressive perception of gender. But I won't just rehash all the same talking points and arguments you'll already know if this isn't your first day on leftist YouTube. I'd like to address the real-world effects of wholeheartedly embracing this progressive line of thinking, something I don't think I've seen anyone else do to such an extent before. It's one thing to sit around all day and argue over the philosophy of what performative appearance and social expectations all mean, but there's no point in learning all this social theory if you're not going to use it somehow. When this channel talks organising and activism, I want to discuss the practicalities. But first, just to get us all on the same page though, here's the abridged progressive history of gender norms. At the dawn of civilization, the first primitive societies all split their populations in half to divide essential labour, and they did so along the most physically obvious line, sexual dimorphism. That way, one half of society, the bigger, stronger, faster half, can do all the hunting and gathering and fighting and so on. And the other half is entrusted to do the equally important job of rearing and raising children until they themselves are old enough to contribute in whichever way they're expected and biologically predetermined to do. As these early societies grew in population and social complexity, both an explicit administrative structure of laws and an implicit system of cultural and social norms sprung up around them to reinforce these basic behaviours and attitudes towards the two gender roles. Time goes on for several centuries, and what day-to-day life, a career, and the exact form that the administrative state apparatuses all look like vary throughout history and between geographic regions. But the common outcome is that we've now arrived at a point where global neoliberal capitalism still upholds the modern-day evolution of this to keep itself running. Now, for basically all of living memory, the ideal domestic situation across the increasingly culturally homogenized Western world has been that men, who like blue and wear trousers, work a white-collar job to provide for their dress-wearing, pink-liking, homebound wives, who in turn raise his 2.5 children and try their best to look pretty. Now I, and most leftists, could go on for hours about how capital will throw around a lot of weight to either crush or otherwise nullify dissent from its social standards, lest the whole system go up in smoke, because of the terminal crisis at the heart of all extractive commerce, all the more quicker. This is what the patriarchy refers to, a term you'll have no doubt at least heard before. It's not a literal group of people or even a set of codified beliefs per se, but rather the material basis capital has for oppressing women even more than the baseline amount of exploitation it does to everyone. Institutional or systemic sexism is when the cultural attitudes this discrimination has created become so pervasive it affects every aspect of daily life, like enabling hurtful jokes and stereotypes about female incompetence or ignorance, or normalizing hiring practices that make it harder for women to find jobs. I'm sure there's a BreadTube video you've already seen that could explain this to you in a much more drawn-out way. But realistically, if you're ever seeing this, you get the gist of what I'm talking about already anyway. Here's the thing. If you do understand all that, and you consciously think sexism is bad, as surely we all do, and even if you yourself are in fact a woman, you still almost certainly have some underlying biases and prejudices in your thinking, just as a result of having been raised in this society. That's not good, but it is normal, and here on the left we acknowledge this and try and work on it. Incidentally, the same thing goes with something like race, and how skin colour now overlaps very broadly with economic prospects in much of the colonial First World and so on. Very few people you'll ever encounter actually think of themselves as racist, but everyone, especially people in a position of societal privilege, can't help but have the culture they're born in and raised in affect their thinking in some way. It's a simple enough idea to understand, at least I think it is. Anyway, all this primer actually brings me to the point of this video. Ever since our conceptual framework of gender moved from being rooted in strict biological essentialism over to being a matter of performative semantics and semiotics, we've now got a new term that describes something that's very similar to that sort of underlying bias we've described before as systemic racism or systemic sexism. This new term is cisheteronormativity, which is admittedly a bit of a mouthful, but what it means is that even people who consciously consider themselves progressive and support LGBT rights still treat one-man, one-woman relationships and open-quote traditional gender roles as the norm. Most people, including a lot of progressives, will essentially just assume they're straight because it's the default setting and just uncritically go with it, rather than ever putting any real thought into their identity. Say, for example, go find your average straight white male progressive campus type. They'll readily tell you that gender roles are all made up and that anyone can wear whatever they want and so on. Then ask them something like how regularly they go out in public in skirts and dresses. What a shock, it's never. And of course they'll say it's just because it's not their personal style. And that's perfectly valid. It's perfectly true even. But why isn't it something they'd wear? Because they've been raised since birth in a culture that would disapprove of them doing so. Similarly, that same type of avowed progressive will claim to believe that trans women are real women, but just flat out won't ever consider dating or even hooking up with one. The reason being, even if they have fully taken on board the argument that gender is made up, they can't get over their deeply internalized hang-ups about it. And honestly, I think people in activist and political organizing spaces could be doing more to get over their own unconscious cis-heteronormativity. Just on a purely ideological level, I don't really think your heart can ever truly be in it if you're trying to advocate the progressive line, but can't fully grasp the implications beyond just paying the argument's lip service. And practically, it's one thing to understand all this, but entirely another thing to actually put it to any use. The first time I ever saw what hysterical conservatives call gender ideology, I was in my late teens, and I already knew enough history to acknowledge that the general oeuvre of the transgender rights thesis was correct. Gender roles are made up, and there's nothing inherently biological about what type of clothes you like wearing, or how long your hair is, or even something like wearing makeup. It's all a matter of cultural norms. Furthermore, a few years on, by the time I was in university, it had really taken off too. Everything I just mentioned was practically now entry-level lefty knowledge for people around my age. What we once called biological sex meant nothing in progressive circles now, and people weren't just going from girl to boy and vice versa. We had discovered a whole spectrum of new identities somewhere in the middle. And I, for one, think this is great. Conservatives have been screaming about all sorts of postmodernist slippery slopes for quite a while now. But I don't see why anyone without some psychotic imagined investment in gender norms should care at all. We've gotten to a point where, even in the most milquetoast liberal spaces, you can cite any identity, and it's valid. To describe something is to make it real. No combination of appearance, terms of address, and underlying biology is beyond the pale here. And we're even getting to celebrate people brave enough to come out of the custom pronouns closet. Seeing all this sort of thing in person for the first time after I moved to a city was mind-blowing. And quite frankly, if you can't see how to use this, and maybe even have a little fun with it along the way, I don't know what to tell you. If you've assumed that you can't reap these benefits because you're not, open quote, really trans, you need to start acting pragmatically and give yourself a bit more credit. I personally didn't even get into leftism just for the social causes either. My principal driving motivation was originally just a complete rejection of ever seeing my time and effort alienated from me and used to enrich someone else. But when you're around so many people whose main political cause is queer liberation and trans rights for years, you start to pick up on the lingo and what the pressing issues are. And in short, all the trans-centric discourse basically revolves around what you could call a handful of factions. The first of these factions are the self-styled TERFs, or trans-exclusionary radical feminists. These are the people who are all for open-quote women's issues, but reject the concept of transgenderism. They're usually cis women themselves, and may or may not also be political lesbians or deep into performative misandry. You'll often see these kinds of people trying to open up a platform for themselves in lefty spaces, both in real life and online, but they're actually pretty reactionary and their arguments are wrong and bad. The next group are the trans medicalists. These are people, usually themselves openly trans, who obviously think that transgenderism of at least one stripe is real, but then try to argue that not every trans person is valid. Usually their position boils down to gatekeeping labels based on whether or not someone currently is or intends to medically transition. That means taking the hormones and getting the surgeries and all that. They tend to write off the identities of non-binary people and call themselves transsexuals in order to delineate themselves from other trans people, who incidentally often call them true scum as a pejorative. The third and last of these major factional positions in the contemporary trans discourse doesn't really have a proper name, but it's essentially the most progressive stance of the lot, and it's the one that is pro-trans rights and accepts non-binary identities and basically believes that one's identity affirms itself. There's no gatekeeping. Your existence as a man, as a woman, as neither, or anything else is valid because you've declared it to be. This is also personally the side I'm backing. For one thing, I don't think the strict medicalists are doing themselves any favours by trying to argue that their specific rejection of social norms is legitimate, but anyone else's isn't. And real talk, just to any trans meds who ever inexplicably end up watching this, you do realise that mainstream society sees you the exact same way you see the cringy TikTok they-thems, right? If the real reactionaries got their way and a right-wing death squad had you kneeling before a pit, you aren't going to earn any extra points in their eyes by explaining you're the right kind of trans. As for the argument that transgenderism is a result of some innate biological factor or chemical imbalance in the womb or something like that, and that's why you need to gatekeep the pretenders out, I'm going to say the exact same thing I said years ago when I was hearing the exact same explanation for what caused being gay. I don't believe it for a second, and furthermore, if you genuinely think that being any kind of queer is caused by something you might be able to physically identify prior to birth, you'd better hope science never discovers exactly what it is, because the second that humanity discovers an in utero gay gene or a trans gene, a lot of right-wing people will all of a sudden be completely fine with abortion under one particular circumstance, and you won't be able to get that eugenicist toothpaste back in the tube. To the wider left-wing community's credit, most people in progressive spaces do seem to accept the non-medicalist line on trans issues writ large, self-ID and not gatekeeping identities and all that. But returning to that new term I brought up earlier, cisheteronormativity, I can't say that I think most people have really thought about why non-medicalism is the correct position to take. But let's say you're still here with me. We need to talk about how you finally use all this theory for anything useful. If you want to genuinely acknowledge that anyone can have any identity, or dress however they want, or use whatever names and pronouns you want, you might as well start yourself, or at the very least, change things up every now and then to keep life from getting too stale. It's kind of like a progressive gender accelerationism of a sort. At the very least, when you start suggesting it, you get all the TERFs and the true scums to start climbing out of the woodwork to argue. and it's always nice to clean house in your activist spaces every now and then. And here's the best thing. You could, for example, play dress up and do the new pronouns in all your young, hip lefty spaces, and still be open quote normal everywhere else. Surely you already don't dress and act the same way with friends as you might do at work or at school or in church and with family and so on. You might as well get wild and wacky with it where you can. And let's be frank here, in a lot of leftist circles, your voice will be given less weight if you present as a typical straight white man. That might sound like a right-wing lie, but it's true, and actually it's good, because it's correcting for the fact that those sorts of voices and opinions have long historically been, and still are, given disproportionate weight everywhere else in society because of that aforementioned patriarchy and the institutional racism and sexism and so on. Here's the thing. You can get around a lot of that by being visibly and loudly queer. And here's the magic reason why it works. Because we all agree that simply identifying as something is what makes it real. Knowing this, I won't act in bad faith per se, and my support for queer rights isn't disingenuous. But if we make identity this malleable, but still attach this much meaning to it, then I am going to take it as far as I'm enabled to do so. Bonus points for the fact it makes outright reactionaries and all the bad kind of liberals mad too. I'm perfectly ready, willing, and able to claim any sort of identity and pronouns in the moment if it seems advantageous or fun. And you should be too, quite frankly. And I'll tell you what, there's nothing that gets you over your internalized heteronormativity quicker either. Gatekeeping is bad, but it's kind of done away with when no facet of your identity is necessarily set in stone. Further still, it almost sounds like I'm the regressive one here, but actually, my attitude on the matter is, in reality, the furthest left it seems possible to get at the moment. To put it simply, TERFs are wrong and bad, transmedicalists are wrong and bad, and I will talk over them at every opportunity. A woman-only space sounds innocuous enough, but it's unfortunately often a TERF dog whistle. Fortunately, we can rhetorically maneuver around that sort of argument now. Remember, you're perfectly able to say whatever you need to subvert exclusionary spaces. Say you're a man one day, say you're a woman the next, and non-binary on the weekends if you have to. And if someone ever calls you out for flip-flopping whenever it suits your needs, tell them it's this new thing you've recently discovered called gender fluidity. You can use this sort of attitude in other areas of your life too. It's a nifty little option to always keep in the back of your mind. For example, if you're currently a man and looking for a university grad-level white-collar job and things aren't going great, switch your gender to female on sites like LinkedIn. I guarantee you'll immediately get a lot of recruiters reach out suddenly. I know more than one person who's gotten a very cushy office job doing exactly that, and if I were in their shoes, I'd take it even further and try and bait a discrimination lawsuit out of someone in management and then go crying transphobia to any HR rep who'd listen. If you're ever signing up for car, home, or contents insurance, play around with the different gender options and see how it affects your quote. The results might surprise you, and you can go with whatever leans more in your favor. If you live in a country with mandatory military service or a draft for all men of a certain age, it couldn't hurt to try getting out of that the same way either. Tell all the transmedicalist pick-me's that they're just wallowing in a bucket full of crabs mentality, and that their little pity-party oppression Olympics isn't helping anyone. The funniest thing about saying that is that it's completely true, but they'll still hate hearing it. And more practical advice, if anyone ever calls you duplicitous for acting like this, it's not that hard to rebut them too. I've discussed the righteousness of deceiving reactionaries on this channel before, but you can extend all the same principles to anyone trying to tell you that whatever self-serving gender identity you've just made up on the spot is invalid too. If anyone ever calls you a liar, the go-to should be something along the lines of, no one would ever lie about being trans for the sake of clout. Do you know how rampant transphobia is? Or, I'm entitled to explore and question my labels, aren't I? Brimming with mock indignation. With this newfound attitude, and some funky chosen pronouns, and a sense of complete social invincibility, you could be racking up wins for the gender diverse community all day, every day. Have you ever considered that? Give it some thought, you might even come to like it. Once again, my name's Card. Thank you for watching. I hope you gleaned something from it. And feel free to subscribe to this YouTube page if you'd like to hear more from me. Bye for now, and have a lovely day.